Hello and welcome to Podcast Essentials. Today we're looking at how to choose a show name. I'm joined by my co-host, Rich Bowden from sunny Blaney in Australia, and we'll be getting into this fairly quickly. It's a relatively short topic, but it's an important one. Hello, Rich, are you there?
Yeah, can hear you coming through loud and clear there, John. I hear it's quite warm that way.
Reasonably warm, yeah, but these things happen. It wasn't in the brochure, but never mind. So today we're talking about choosing a show name, and I've got a checklist up on the website for people who have already had a look at that. To start with, if you've got a blog or you're on Instagram or you have a Facebook page, you may already have a name, which is useful. But there are some steps we have to go through to make sure the name works for a podcast, because podcast is a separate medium. I was fortunate enough to have World Organic News as both a blog and as the URL in worldorganicnews.com, so I was able to just use that after I'd checked with iTunes that there was no other shows called that. But if you're starting from scratch and podcasting is going to be your first step into social media or internet performance perhaps, I would suggest that you write out a list of about 5 names and then order them how you think they should be, which sounds best, which sounds least good, and then give them to friends and family to have a read, see what they think, rate them 1 to 5. And then when they come back to you, ask them to explain to you what the show's about from the name, because that's really important. Because it's when you're close to it, it's too easy to get carried away and think, oh, I'm being really clever. I know of a story of one man that came up with the name of After the Darkness, which sounded like a really good, title anyway. And so he asked what people thought it would be about, and they said, oh, going through a spiritual change, beginning a new phase of your life. What he actually wanted to talk about was life after having gone blind. And you can see where he got the title from, but by changing it to life after blindness, you narrow down your niche and it's fairly obvious who's going to listen and what it's going to be about. So you need to be a little bit, what's the word I'm after, less creative or tighter in your creativity.
More focused, yeah.
It's also important, I think, to have a shortish title if you can, because it's easier for people to remember. But that's not necessarily the case. So when you've done been and your friends and family have had a look and rated it and told you what they think, go to a Facebook page if you've got one, or your Facebook friends who you don't know personally, but you've only met on Facebook. So there's that separation between you and them, and run it past them and follow the same process. I think it's important to come up with a name that actually describes what the show's going to be about. So this one's Podcast Essentials, and it'll be podcast on PodThoughts, which sort of gives the idea, I hope, that this is thinking about podcasting. You can always add a subtitle. So with PodThoughts, it's towards a new manifesto for podcasting. So you can add a little bit to explain it, but the punchline has to be direct and to the point. So World Organic News says what's on the tin. It's about news from the organic world, from farming to alternative energy to global warming to Monsanto. Not that Monsanto exists anymore, but that's a whole other podcast. And I remember when we were coming up with names for the show we co-hosted, Rich, it took us about, probably a fortnight, 2 weeks, back and forth.
I think I have to say it was probably at least a dozen coffees each. So we had a lot of fun.
Yeah, and it's, we finally settled on the name of The Real Food Chain because there was a BBC show called The Food Chain, where that's all about industrial farming. So by adding the word real to the front of it, we were able to get the idea across that it was about whole foods and things like that. So hopefully when you go through the process, you'll come to some conclusion that makes sense both for you, but more importantly for your listeners. Because a lot of people, there's a lot of nonsense spoken about new and noteworthy. When I search for a podcast, I go to an area, like a subject area, and then I'll read the titles. If something catches my eye, then I'm more likely to have a listen before I subscribe rather than just flick past it. So I think the name's important. The artwork is too, but we'll get to that later. So once you've come up with your name, there's a couple of steps still before you can use it. The first thing, of course, is to go to iTunes and see and search the name just to make sure no one else is using it. There was a lady who was going to do a podcast on life after retirement and the transition into that life, and she was going to call it After Work, but there was already one called After Work, which was about social activities you could do after work. So the name was already taken, so we had to have a bit of a rethink. And once you've got that and it's not on iTunes, you're halfway there. You then need to Google the name just to see if anyone else is using it for other things and whether or not there's some sort of proprietary claim on the name or copyright or whatever like that. And provided all this is clear, I would recommend at the very least getting hold of the URL, even if you're not going to host your show notes and blog and whatnot that associate with the podcast. If you're not going to do your self-hosting to start with, because you're just going to test it, at least buy the URL. So I've got one that's been sitting there for years called History of Artillery Podcast, which I haven't gotten around to producing yet, but I've got the URL so that no one else can take it. If you can get one either .com or .com.au or .ie or .co.uk, wherever you happen to be, at least grab it as soon as you can, because once you get famous podcasting, which is bound to happen to some of us, someone else will buy the name in the hope that they can sell it to you for a profit. Yeah. Now, the other thing to consider with the name is how will it look in a thumbnail on a smartphone? Because people will look at that. That's the artwork is what people see when they're scrolling through before they read the name quite often, because as humans, we're drawn to images rather than words, given our biological evolution. So if the title is too long, it's going to be really, really tiny and difficult to see on a thumbnail. Now, some people search on larger images, but most people use the thumbnails. So thinking carefully about that. I mean, when we came up with the Real Food Chain, we had it took a lot longer than coming up with the name to get the image right. But we were able to get the knife and fork on the image so that people knew that it was about food. And I think we got the name right in a sort of a circle around the knife and fork, so it looked like it was a plate. So it again reinforced the images of food. Do you remember the process at all, Rich?
I remember we had the podcast too, so that people that immediately were going through it could see that it is a podcast, that might not be in, say, iTunes. But I sort of remember we got to that stage, John, and we came up with a whole lot of different ideas and templates. And the thing that concerned me was to get the color right. Once we got the color right, and with something that was to do with whole foods, I wanted either something that was say green, but that was kind of overdone. No disrespect intended, Mr. Moore, but the other one I wanted was the brown earth, something that would signify that. And we got the color right eventually. First, I think we started, it was a bit too light, I wanted something that would reflect growing and growing from the earth. And yeah, once that was sorted, I think it was plain sailing from there. I remember you came up with the idea of the fork and keeping that. Again, it's when people are flicking through iTunes and they're scrolling down, up and down, you needed something that's going to catch their eye straight away, because you only got their attention for, a millisecond, and it has to be something that they want to know, and know exactly what it was that they were looking for. So we had the color right. We have a basic image that had a fork and the name, which the real food chain was, so people could see it straight away. So I think we pretty much nailed it in the end.
Yeah, I think there's some good ideas to keep in mind when you're coming up with your name. Even the real food chain is 4 words. That's probably about as long as you want to get. There are other, there's a fellow who does a online radio show with his name at the start. And then that's starting to get, 5, 6 words. And depending on how you design it, it can be difficult to read. Quite often people also are keen on having their own photos on there, and that's a thing too, if you like. And it's not that difficult to find a graphic designer there to do it for you. We ended up doing our own because what the hell, that's what we do. We can work it out when it worked out okay, I think. Now, the thing with all this is also to remember that we have a new, what's the word I'm after? Perhaps not an 800-pound gorilla yet. That's iTunes still. But we've got a young fella who's maybe going to challenge the silverback in the room with the new Google podcasting app, which is available, only on Android. So having gone through a quick look at the new app, the same rules apply in that not so much for adding them because they seem to be scraping it from iTunes, but the same rules for thumbnails, readability, that sort of thing, and obviousness about what the podcast's about still apply. I mean, Google may end up setting up their own directory eventually. I don't know. Excuse me. But for the moment, we need to follow the same process. And the thing with the artwork and the name is that it has to be for Apple, between 1400 by 1400 all the way up to 3000 by 3000 pixels. So you need the words to be legible at big sizes and small, which is a design process. I mean, you just do it as a vector for those who know what that's about, or you get your graphic designer to do it for you. And I think it's probably worth, if you're not good with images, it is probably worthwhile getting someone to do it for you who's an expert in it. And it's only a one-off cost, but, and it's a hobby, so maybe you don't want to do that. But I would avoid white backgrounds with black lettering. It's sort of it doesn't stand out, or it stands out for the wrong reason. It can look unprofessional and cheap, unless it's done properly, obviously. And the square's an odd shape to work with as well, but it's what they want, so that's what we do. So it's a pretty straightforward process picking your show name. You come up with one, you check it with people to make sure they understand what it's about. You make sure that no one on iTunes is using it already. You make sure that you can actually use it on Google. And once Google's podcast app becomes more established, I suspect, and I believe I read somewhere, that they're going to start indexing audio as well as images and text. So it'll be important because the image will be associated with the audio, I would imagine, when you do a Google search. So these things are important. And then once you've got your working title and it checks out in iTunes and Google, I would highly recommend getting your own URL and probably hosting it as well. But that's a personal thing. I just like, if it's being hosted on, say, WordPress or Weebly or something, someone else has control of your site. And if the rules change or they don't like something you're doing, you can be shut down and you're gone. Google can still do that sort of thing too, and I guess Apple can as well. But the rules are fairly well set with them, so you know where you stand. And then, of course, the most important thing once you've gone through all this hard work is to start recording. It's too easy to procrastinate over the name and the artwork and worry for too long about whether or not it's right. The thing about podcasting is, to be a podcaster, you must podcast. So don't forget to start recording. And that's pretty much it for today's presentation. On Friday morning, I'll be talking about how to pick a host. We went through that in the last show about where on the mechanics of podcasting. So we all know that a host has to hold our audio files, and Apple just accesses them through an RSS feed, and same with Google. So it'll be about 9:30 next Friday morning, my time, which is about 6:30, I think yours, Mr. Rich.
I think it is. I think it is, John. Yes.
Yeah. Until they change all the daylight saving settings again, but we're okay for the moment. So with that, I'll draw this one to a conclusion, and I'll see you all on Friday. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, John. Very good.